answer the question, what was Hitler's final solution?
We know that as a boy, Hitler was tormented, humiliated, and mocked by his father, without his mother being able to protect him. We also know that he denied his true feelings toward his father. The real source of his hatred thus become obvious. I had gone in search of the true motives, not only for Hitler's mental makeup, but also for that of many other dictators. In all of them I identified the effects of hatred of at least one parent that remained unconscious. This hatred remained repressed because hating one's father was strictly prohibited, and because it was in the interests of the child's self-preservation to maintain the illusion of having a good father. Only in the form of a deflection onto others was hatred permitted, and then it could flow freely. As long as one projects hatred and fear onto scapegoats, there is no way of coming to terms with these feelings. Not until the cause has been recognized as the natural reaction to wrongdoing understood, can the blind hatred wreaked on innocent victims be dissipated. The function it performs, that of masking the truth, is no longer necessary. There is evidence, as I cite in my preface, that sex criminals who have worked through their lives in therapy may no longer run the risk of a destructive reenactment of their traumas. But what is hatred? As I see it, it is a possible consequence of the rage and despair that cannot be consciously felt by a child who has been neglected and maltreated even before he or she has learned to speak. An animal will respond to attack with fight or flight. Neither course is open to an infant exposed to aggression from immediate family members. Thus, the natural reaction remains pent up, sometimes for decades, until it can be taken out on a weaker object. Then, these repressed emotions will be vented uninhibitedly on minorities. We call this xenophobia, and the victims differ from country to country. Turks, Sinti, Biafrans, Hutus, Tutsis, or whatever. In Mao's China, it was the intellectuals. But the reasons for this hatred are the same everywhere. As long as the anger directed at a parent or other first caregiver remains unconscious or disavowed, it cannot be dissipated. It can be taken out only on oneself or stand-ins, on scapegoats, such as one's own children or alleged enemies. The variety of hatred that masquerades as righteous, ideological zeal is particularly dangerous because its imperviousness to moral categories makes it unassailable. Sympathetic observation of the cries of an infant brings home forcibly to the onlooker how intense the feelings involved must be. The hatred can finally work as a life-saving defense against the life-threatening powerlessness. Martin Luther, for example, was an intelligent and educated man, but he hated all Jews, and he encouraged parents to beat their children. He was no perverted sadist, but 400 years before Hitler, he was disseminating this kind of destructive counsel. His mother had beaten him severely long before he was treated this way by his father and his teacher, and he believed this punishment had done him good, and was therefore justified. The conviction stored in his body that if parents do it, then it must be right, to torment someone weaker than yourself, left a much more lasting impression on him than the divine commandments of the Christian exhortations to love your neighbor and be compassionate toward the weak. Similar cases are discussed by Philip Greven in his highly informative book Spare the Child. He quotes various American men and women of the church recommending cruel beatings for babies and infants in the first few months of life, as a way of ensuring that the lesson thus learned remains indelibly impressed on them for the rest of their lives. Unfortunately, they were only too right. These terrible destructive texts, which have misled so many parents, are the conclusive proof of the long-lasting effect of beating. They could have been written only by people who were exposed to merciless beatings as children, and later glorified what they had been through. In my work, I have often referred to Hitler and Stalin as graphic examples of the effects cruelty to children can have on society at large. In response, many people countered by saying that they had often been beaten themselves and that had not made war criminals out of them. Asked in more detail about their early years, they invariably disclosed that there had been at least one person who had shown them honesty, affection, or love, even though that person had not been able to protect them from physical mistreatment. This type of figure, I use the term helping witness, can also be found in the biography of Dostoevsky, who by all accounts had an extremely violent father, but a loving mother. Hitler's specific problems with the Jews can in fact be traced back to the period before his birth. In her youth, his paternal grandmother had been employed in a Jewish merchant's household in Graz. After her return home to the Austrian village of Braunau, she gave birth to a son, Alois, later to become Hitler's father, and received child support payments from the family in Graz for 14 years. This story, which is recounted in many biographies of Hitler, represented a dilemma for the Hitler family. They had an interest in denying that the young woman had been left with child, either by the Jewish merchant or his son. On the other hand, it was impossible to assert that a Jew would pay alimony for so long without good reason. Such generosity on the part of a Jew would have been inconceivable for the inhabitants of an Austrian village. Thus, the Hitler family was faced with the insoluble dilemma of devising a version that would serve to nullify their disgrace. For Alois Hitler, the suspicion that he might be of Jewish descent was insufferable in the context of the anti-Jewish environment he grew up in. All the plaudits he himself earned as a customs officer were insufficient to liberate him from the latent rage at the disgrace and humiliation visited on him through no fault of his own. The only thing he could do with impunity was to take out his rage on his son Adolf. According to the reports of his daughter Angela, he beat his son mercilessly every day. In an attempt to exorcise his childhood fears, his son nurtured the maniac delusion that it was up to him to free not only himself of Jewish blood, but also all Germany, and later the whole world. Right up to his death in the bunker, Hitler remained a victim of his delusion because all his life his fear of his half-Jewish father had remained locked in his unconscious mind. Many people have told me that they find them highly unsettling and in no way sufficient to explain Hitler's actions. Not all his actions, perhaps, but certainly his delusions. And those delusions are, at the very least, the foundation of his actions. I can certainly picture the boy Hitler swearing vengeance on the Jews. Those monstrous fantasy figures of an already diseased imagination. Consciously, he probably thought he could have led a happy life if the Jew had not plunged his grandmother into the disgrace that he and his family had to live with. And it was this that in his eyes served to excuse the batterings he received from his father, who after all was himself a victim of the evil and omnipotent Jew. In the mind of an angry, seriously confused child, it is only a short step from there to the idea that all Jews should be exterminated. Not only Jews. In the household of Hitler's family lived for years the very unpredictable schizophrenic aunt, Johanna, whose behavior is reported to have been very frightening for the child. As an adult, Hitler ordered every handicapped and psychotic person to be killed, to free the German society from this burden. Germany seemed for him to symbolize the innocent child who had to be saved. Consequently, Hitler wanted to protect his nation from the dangers he himself had been faced with. Absurd? Not at all. For an unconscious mind, this kind of symbolization might sound very normal and logical.
And really, the story here has to begin with Hitler's publication of his autobiography Mein Kampf, in which he really categorized all of his vision of Germany as a struggle, a social Darwinian struggle for survival between Aryans and Jews. And the idea that he had was that one was going to win at the expense of the other. And it was his belief that Aryans, Germans, had to win by exterminating the Jewish race. Now, of course, those ideas of his, when published in Mein Kampf, were relatively obscure because he was a not so well-known, not so respected, and really not that feared leader of a failed uprising in Munich. So it wasn't, this huge thing. But of course, Mein Kampf would become sort of the defining document of the Nazi order that became so destructive. And when they came to power, they began to create concentration camps. These were initially designed for political prisoners. Now, the concentration camps were meant to bring together enemies of the state, and increasingly there started to be signs that this included European Jews. And in the years after the Nazis came to power, they started to pass a series of laws which culminated in the Nuremberg laws of 1935. Among all of these laws that were passed, Jews were excluded from public service, they were excluded from education, they were denied citizenship, they were denied marriage rights with Germans, and they were systematically defined as a separate race than the Aryan Germans. Jews, of course, were forced to wear the Star of David, and that would make it easy to identify who these people were, on penalty of death if they didn't wear it. Now, all of these laws made a real impact on the lives of German Jews. But the night of Kristallnacht is generally accepted as the beginning of what will become known as the Holocaust. After the assassination of a minor German official by a Jewish boy, there was a general declaration that the Jews should feel the wrath of the German people. On the night of Kristallnacht, or the night of broken glass, as it translates, Jewish businesses and synagogues were targeted, Jews were rounded up, and up to 30,000 of them were imprisoned and sent off to concentration camps. Now, the initial German policy was one of immigration. In other words, the Nazi Party encouraged Jews to leave the country, and many Jews who had the means to and who had the willingness to did leave the country. They went to places like Poland and Russia, Denmark, Sweden, France. They went to lots of the places, honestly, where Germany would end up taking over in the coming years, and their safety would disappear. Many of the fortunate ones who survived this and escaped this came to places like the United States and were able to avoid the entire situation, for the most part at least. Those Jews who were not able to or not willing to immigrate were placed into ghettos. This began after the invasion of Poland, and the most famous of these was the ghetto in Warsaw, where all of the Jews of Warsaw and surrounding regions were put into a very small central area where they were cut off completely from the lives of the rest of the people. And there they lived in horrible conditions, underfed, overworked, and overcrowded. As the German troops moved further through Poland and eventually into Russia, there was a group that was formed called the Einsatzgruppen. This was sort of a subgroup created by the SS, which was going to be in charge of, well, they were basically mobile killing squads. They would follow in the wake of the German army. They would move into different villages. They would round up the Jews that were there. They would kill them. This was a somewhat effective way of doing things, and the Einsatzgruppen went at it very fanatically, ending up killing nearly 1 million Jews throughout Poland and Western Russia. But there was a morale issue that started to develop. The face-to-face killing over time started to really psychologically damage these members of this group. And the German leadership started to realize that they needed to have a different solution and a more efficient solution, I guess, in order to accomplish the goal of the extermination of the Jewish race. So they start to build even more concentration camps. And very specifically, they built 6 concentration camps which were going to be designed as death camps. These were going to be the tools, the mechanized way that the Nazi regime was going to eliminate Jews. In January of 1942, at the Wannsee Conference, the plans for the Holocaust, the final solution, were unveiled to high members of the Nazi Party. It would consist of these concentration or death camps. At these death camps, Jews were going to be stripped, their hair was going to be cut off, and they were going to be taken into a shower chamber in which the Nazis were going to release a gas called Zyklon B and kill everyone who was in there. The bodies were then taken to crematoria, burned, and the furnaces basically ran 24/7. Over the course of the next 3 years, somewhere between 3 and 4 million Jews were killed in these death camps. The sheer numbers are almost impossible to fathom. To put it in some sort of perspective, by the end of the war, nearly 90% of the Jewish population of Germany, Poland, and the Baltic states was eliminated. And overall, about 2/3 of the entire Jewish population of Europe died at the hands of the Nazis. So that's an overview of Hitler's final solution, his attempt to try and rid the world, at least Europe, of its Jewish population.
What made respected members of society suddenly act like monsters? How can a former teacher like Klaus Barbie and other men, described by their daughters as kind, caring fathers, have innocent people tortured, or indeed do the torturing themselves? Goldhagen does not address this question. He is obviously convinced that references to traditional anti-Semitism in Germany provide a satisfactory answer. They do not. The hypothesis that German anti-Semitism was the real reason for the Holocaust has been rightly criticized by urging a comparison with the First World War. At that time, anti-Semitism was just as strong in Germany, but no organized genocide resulted. And why no Holocaust in the other anti-Semitic countries, Poland, Russia, and other parts of Europe? The argument that in the Weimar Republic unemployment and poverty caused immense general frustration that was discharged via the mass murder of the Jews is hardly convincing, given that Hitler was quickly successful in getting unemployment under control. I myself have yet to come across a criminal of that kind who was not a victim as a child. The problem is that most of these people are unaware of their motives. They have no access to their feelings and memories. Daniel J. Goldhagen's book is based largely on testimonies of perpetrators. This approach enables him to cast light on the emotional lives of these people and make them accessible to further study. The quotations and the picture material establish beyond all doubt that the expressions of satisfaction and enjoyment on the faces of the tormentors are a true reflection of the pleasure they took in killing and maiming. The numerous and widely read tracts by Dr. Daniel Gottlieb Moritz Schreber, the inventor of the Schrebergärten, the German word for small allotments, are of major interest here. Some of them ran to as many as 40 editions, and their central concern was to instruct parents in the systematic upbringing of infants from the very first day of life. Many people, motivated by what they thought to be the best of intentions, complied with the advice given to them by Schreber and other authors about how best to raise their children if they wanted to make them into model subjects of the German Reich. They did this without even remotely suspecting that they were exposing their children to a systematic form of torture with long-term effects. German sayings and catchphrases. like "Praise be to the things that make us tough," and "What doesn't kill us will strengthen us," still to be heard from educationists of the old school, probably originated in this period. Morton Schutzman, who quotes highly enlightening passages from Schreber's writings, is of the opinion that here we are in the presence not of child-rearing methods, but of systematic instruction in child persecution. One of Schreber's convictions is that when babies cry, they should be made to desist by the use of physically perceptible admonitions, assuring his readers that such a procedure is only necessary once, or at the most twice, and then one is master of the child for all time. From then on, one look, one single threatening gesture will suffice to subjugate the child. Above all, the newborn child should be drilled from the very first day to obey and to refrain from crying. Today, people who have been brought up in anything even remotely approaching a humane way will hardly be able to imagine the rigor and tenacity with which Schreber himself implemented this program. Psychoanalyst Wilhelm G. Nederland quotes examples that cast light on the everyday practical conduct of child rearing in those decades. For example, recipes for inculcating the art of self-denial into infants. The method should be simple and effective. The child is placed on the lap of its nanny while the latter is eating or drinking whatever takes her fancy. However urgent the infant's oral needs may become, in this situation, they must not be gratified. Nederland, page 98, quotes an account by Schreber from his own family life. A nanny eating pears while holding one of his children on her lap was unable to resist the temptation of giving the infant a slice. She was immediately dismissed. The news of this draconian measure quickly spread to all the other nannies in Leipzig, and from that time on, writes Schreber, he never again encountered such unsubordination, neither by that child nor with any of the others that came later. The children systematically subjected to obedience drills around the turn of the century were exposed not only to corporal correction but also to severe emotional deprivation. The upbringing manuals of the day described physical demonstrations of affection such as stroking, cuddling and kissing as indications of a doting, mollycoddling attitude. Parents were warned of the disastrous effects of spoiling their children, a form of indulgence entirely incompatible with the prevalent ideal of rigor and severity. As a result, infants suffered from the absence of direct loving contact with the parents. The best they could hope for was to find some kind of substitute from the servants, who in numerous cases used and exploited them as objects of pleasure, thus frequently adding to the children's emotional confusion. Contrary to the received opinion prevalent only a few years ago, the human brain at birth is not fully developed. The abilities a person's brain develops depend on experiences in the first 3 years of life. Studies on abandoned and severely mistreated Romanian children revealed striking lesions in certain areas of the brain and marked emotional and cognitive insufficiencies in later life. According to very recent neurobiological findings, repeated traumatization leads to release of stress hormones that attack the sensitive tissue of the brain and destroy existing neurons. Other studies of mistreated children have revealed that the areas of the brain responsible for the management of the emotions are 20 to 30% smaller than in normal persons. The studies in question suggest that not only active battering, but also the absence of loving physical contact between child and parent will cause certain areas of the brain, notably those responsible for the emotions, to remain underdeveloped. Hence, the children subjugated by looks suffered emotional harm that was only to develop its full destructive potential in the next generation. Present-day neurobiological research makes it easier for us to understand the way Nazis like Eichmann, Himmler, Höss, and others functioned. The rigorous obedience training they underwent in earliest infancy stunted the development of such human capacities as compassion and pity for the sufferings of others. They were incapable of emotion in the face of misfortune, as documented in my book For Your Own Good. Such feelings were alien to them. What Himmler called freedom in his famous speech in Poznan was in fact total emotional atrophy. It enabled the perpetrators of the most heinous crimes imaginable to function normally and to continue to impress their environment with their efficiency in the years after the war. There were other factors at play that have hitherto been ignored, factors going some way to explaining why the Holocaust happened in Germany and why it happened at this particular time rather than another. In my view, the operative factor is definitely the destructive child-rearing style practiced widely on infants around the turn of the century in Germany, a style I have no hesitation in referring to as a universal abuse of infants. Of course, children in other countries have been and still are mistreated in the name of upbringing or caregiving, but hardly with the systematic thoroughness characteristic of the so-called poisonous pedagogy, schwarze Pädagogik. In the 2 generations before Hitler's rise to power, the implementation of this method was brought to a high degree of perfection in Germany. With this foundation to build on, Hitler finally achieved what he wanted. My ideal of education is hard, Whatever is weak must be hammered away. In the fortresses of my militant order, a generation of young people will grow to strike fear into the heart of the world. Violent, masterful, unafraid, cruel youth is what I want. Young people must be all that. They must withstand pain. There must be nothing weak or tender about them. The free, magnificent predator must flash from their eyes again. I want them strong and beautiful. That way I can fashion things anew. This education program, revolving on the extermination of everything life-giving, was the forerunner of Hitler's plans for the extermination of an entire nation. In the lives of all the tyrants I examined, I found without exception paranoid trains of thought bound up with their biographies in early youth and the repression of the experiences they had been through. Mao sent 30 million people to their death, but he never fully admitted the extent of the rage he felt for his own father. Stalin caused millions to suffer and die because, even at the height of his power, his actions were determined by unconscious infantile fear of powerlessness. Apparently his father, a poor cobbler from Georgia, attempted to drown his frustration with liquor and whipped his son almost every day. His mother displayed psychotic traits, was completely incapable of defending her son, and was usually away from home, either praying in church or running the priest's household. Stalin idealized his parents right up to the end of his life, and was constantly haunted by the fear of dangers that had long since ceased to exist, but were still present in his deranged mind. The same is true of many other tyrants. The groups of people they singled out for persecution and the rationalization mechanisms they employed were different in each case, but the fundamental reason behind it was similar. They often drew on ideologies to disguise the truth of their own paranoia, and the masses chimed in enthusiastically because they were unaware of the real motives, including those operative in their own biographies. The infantile revenge fantasies of individuals would be of no account if society did not regularly show such naive alacrity in helping to make them come true. As there has so far been little scientific inquiry into the effects of early cruelty on the later lives of the victims, there is correspondingly little mention of them in historical and anthropological studies. It is a well-known fact that things learned early in life are extremely hard to dislodge. In the course of time, they can become second nature. This does not, of course, exonerate the perpetrators of such criminal deeds, but it should motivate us to seriously consider the hypothesis that the propensity for active and voluntary involvement in organized genocide and torture is not a quirk of nature, an act of God. The individuals displaying such inclinations belong to the sizable group of people who have never developed the capacity to feel pity and compassion, or else have forfeited that capacity very early. The brains of these people may otherwise function impeccably, and this coupled with their crippling deficits in the emotional sphere make them ideal instrument for the implementation of the crazed designs of paranoid leaders.